and give you a little idea. Ooh. Help me here, John. Different keyboard than I'm used to. Oh, that's where it is. And I want to introduce this. I have been waiting to do this for years. Before I go into this, I want to just give you kind of my bona fides on this thing. I am genetically pro-union. You know I grew up in Detroit, most of you know that. My father was actually a UAW member from 1940, member of the Auto Workers Union, from 1940 to 1980, and he retired as vice president of the Auto Workers Union and director of the General Motors Department. He negotiated most of the contracts with General Motors, and you can imagine as a teenager or a preteen trying to negotiate your weekly allowance with somebody with such skills. I went off to the University of Michigan, and in order to work my way through the University of Michigan, every summer I worked at Ford Rawsonville's parts plant, where I built, as I think you know, planned obsolescence into carburetors, and I was an active member of Local 898 of the Auto Workers Union. And then I also worked as a busboy in the dormitory where I lived, and ended up, because we were so badly paid, forming the only student employees union, undergraduate union in the United States, the University of Michigan Student Employees Union. And indeed, we won a historic battle in 1963 to raise our wages from 75 cents an hour to the state minimum wage of $1.25, a 66% wage increase, still probably better than any union has ever won in the history of this country. I've been very active in the union since then. I taught at the University of Massachusetts for 11 years and was active in the Mass Teachers Association, and was then randomly selected by the president of the National Education Association, Bob Chase, the former president, as the randomly selected rank and file member who went to something like 30 states. Last year, I did an op-ed in the Globe which caused some consternation among my union friends because it was entitled, "Is There a Future for Public Unions?" ? It got picked up by The Economist magazine, and I have been on the road ever since, speaking before public employee unions across the country. What I did is I put together a slideshow. I'm going to use a few of those slides. They are on the website so you can see all the rest. But let's take a look at where we are today. I want to go back and talk about my union, the UAW. In 1960s, when I was a member of the union, we had 1.5 million members, brothers and sisters in my union with me. The economic clout of my union helped provide excellent wages and benefits, perhaps the best in the country, and set this really standard for union collective bargaining across the country. But equally important, and I want to bring this up, and I'm hoping our guest speakers will talk to it too, is the UAW was one of the most respected progressive forces in the nation. Fighting for universal health care, Walter Reuther, the president of the union, is credited by Senator Ted Kennedy as bringing the idea of universal health insurance to his own campaign. It led the civil rights movement. Walter Reuther was the only white person who headed up the March on Washington in 1963, along with Martin Luther King and others. Workforce training, fight against poverty. Its political clout helped boost the national minimum wage, despite the fact that not even one of those 1.5 million members of the UAW benefited from it. It fought for workers everywhere. When it sang Solidarity Forever, it was not simply talking about solidarity for UAW members. Solidarity Forever at the UAW under Walter Reuther meant solidarity of all workers, I might add, in all countries. Because of its progressive stance, it enjoyed widespread popular support. It was consulted by presidents and governors and had a massive impact on progressive legislation, not only in the state of Michigan and the Midwest, where there were many UAW plants, but throughout the country. It was interesting because what the UAW won in 1946, and then again in 48, 2 years later, was what has become called the traditional workplace contract. In fact, I wrote a book about this with my late father, Irving Bluestone, called Negotiating the Future. And in going back historically, we found out what was the core ingredients of this new contract that the UAW and General Motors pioneered in 1946. It included AIF COLA, that's an annual improvement factor, and cost of living agreement. Every year, UAW members under the contract would get a wage increase equal to the increase in productivity in the manufacturing sector of the whole United States economy. And those increases and the wage base would be protected against inflation through a cost of living adjustment. There were all kinds of what we used to call fringe benefits: life insurance, health insurance, pensions, which had not existed before these new contracts. You had seniority protection. Workers who had built up seniority didn't have to worry about losing their jobs to some young upstart who would come into the plant and might be able to do the job a little bit faster or talk back a little less. You had grievance machinery, so that workers had a say if in fact they were disciplined. They had a legal right to challenge that through the union. They had work rules and job classifications, which originally had been instituted by the companies in order to try and break up work into small little pieces and control the individual worker. The union agreed to keep those work rules and job classifications. They had a union security clause, which said that the union was there to stay. It was check-off so that the union dues came right out of the paycheck. And you also finally then had the management rights clause, or paragraph 8, in the GM agreement, which basically said that everything that is not written down in the contract still remains the sole prerogative of management. Well, what that did was create America's middle class, because it spread from the UAW and GM to the rest of the auto industry, and then the steel industry, the electrical goods industry, and ultimately after, in the 1960s, to the public sector as well. And if you think about it, what did it do for us? AIF COLA said that every year you're going to get a wage increase, and it will be protected against inflation. Fringe benefits, seniority protection, grievance machinery, work rules and job classifications, and a union security clause said your job is secure. We converted a working class, which was insecure, into a middle class that had a very high degree of security. They went out and spent, and we had an entire generation that we talked about in the first class from 1947 to 73, in which the average American saw their real standard of living double in a single generation, something that has never occurred in this country and is only now occurring in China, right? So we have all of these benefits. Today, the UAW has fewer than 355,000 members. I was very proud that this summer they invited me to be one of their keynote speakers at their convention. But it was sad to see that the latest numbers were only 355,000 from 1.5 million. Its economic and political clout is a shadow of what it once was, and much of the decline is due to the extraordinary blunders made by management in the auto industry, GM, Ford, Chrysler. But my argument was the union was also partly to blame. My union, my dad, right? What are some of the things we had as a problem? Number one, it failed to press the auto companies to build high-quality, innovative vehicles that could compete with imports. One of my father's stories that he tells in the book we wrote together is that when he became vice president of the UAW upon the untimely death of Walter Reuther in a plane crash, within a week or two, he had had a big banner put up, a big poster printed, which said, "Quality is our concern too," with the UAW logo. And he ordered that it be put up on every UAW bulletin board in every plant. The UAW have the right to have their own bulletin boards. Within hours, he gets a call from the vice president for human relations telling my dad, "Tear it down. You have no right to put that sign up. Quality is our prerogative, not yours." And my father's response was, "If you want us to strike the entire General Motors company, you'll touch one of those banners." But that was the way it was. This is 1971. This is not 1492, right? The union, however, often insisted on work rules that undermined efficiency and made the auto industry less competitive with its foreign competitors, and even its foreign competitors operating here in the United States. And to a great extent, it didn't listen to its customers, those who bought its cars, its trucks, and its vans. I tell many stories as a UAW member and as somebody who loves the auto industry about the automobiles we produced and how they compared with the competition, not favorably. And therefore, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, all non-union, came to dominate the industry, and the domestic industry went into decline, and then, of course, most recently, into bankruptcy. We, collectively, still own most of General Motors and Chrysler. Until quite recently, the UAW looked like it was doing fine. The explosion in competition began as a trickle, a few Volkswagen Bugs, right? And then a few Hondas and Toyotas and Nissans. But it was generally ignored by the industry and ignored by the union. The industry and the union were so arrogant that both felt their privileged status would last forever. They sure were wrong. So, let's look at the union movement today. UAW is hardly alone. Today, less than 14% of US workers are union members, down from 35%. And if you exclude the public sector, less than 8%, about 7.2% of all American workers in private industry are members of unions. That's from 35%, basically 7%. And with the union movement's membership so low, private unions have lost much of their power to protect their own members. But I would argue even more importantly, or equally important, is the nation is losing a major force for progressive change. This is what it looks like on a chart. So let's take a look and ask the question very briefly, and then I want to hear from Council President Ross and President Stutman to respond to all of these questions. Could this happen to the public sector unions, right? If you look at the data, the answer seems to be no. The black line tells you what's happened in the private sector. The public sector from 1973 through about the end of the 70s got to the point where they represented about 38, just under 40% of public workers. And through at least 2005, they've continued to maintain their ability to organize and to have as members public sector workers. But I think there are troubling signs ahead. State and local governments are facing massive deficits. You heard all about that last week from Leslie Kerwin and Mike Whitmer. Many parents, particularly in city schools, feel their kids are not getting the education they need. Progressives and Democratic lawmakers, not reactionaries, are now in the forefront of the charter school movement to free school systems from the unions they see as barriers to school reform. And we've seen also, I might add, because I prepared this for teachers' unions, we've seen the same thing happening in terms of police unions, the civilian guarders, the firefighters, etc. Here is what the deficits look like. I don't think we have to go into detail on that. And the fact of the matter is that the cost of state government services, as you may have heard last week, spiraling out of control. Indeed, I recently did some statistics and looked at how fast are the cost of private services versus public services rising. And between 2000 and the first quarter of 2008, according to federal government statistics, the cost of private services have risen by about 27%, the cost of state and local services by about 41%. One question might be, how long can this go on? Moreover, again, picking up on last week's story, if you take just 3 items of the Massachusetts state budget, 3 out of thousands, interest on the debt service, the cost of public pensions for state employees, not local employees, and the state share of Medicaid, back in 2001, just those 3 items cost about 1/3 of state spending, 32.8%. By 2009, 2 fiscal years before, they were up to 46%, just in that one decade, from less than 33 to 46%. If you straight line that, and I'm not suggesting this will happen, in fact, it can't happen, but if you were to straight line that by 2018, 9 years from now, another 9 years, those 3 items in the budget would be 2/3 of the total state budget. And if you go on another 9 years, you're talking about 90%. That can't happen. Something has to change. So, what's the new collective bargaining environment? I would argue that municipal officials have no choice but to demand relief from public service workers or cities and towns will go bankrupt. That as the public begins to recognize how well public sector workers are now doing, one time they were way behind the private sector, and how bad the national and state economies are doing, more and more individuals, including very progressive folks, will side with municipal officials and against public sector unions. Some may cheer the demise of public sector unions, but many former supporters will sit on the sidelines and not come to their rescue. In my opinion, if we lose the union movement, we lose the most progressive force in the country, and we have to prevent that from occurring. So this poses, it seems to be, a serious challenge for public employee unions: teachers unions, firefighters, police officers, sanitation workers. How will state and local governments survive the structural crisis without taking on their unions? Can state and local governments continue to fund public services offered by union workers? Will taxpayers be willing to continue to support public services even if this means more taxes? Those, to me, are the critical issues that face the Commonwealth, face other states, and certainly will face the next governor and our public union leaders. How do we solve the structural deficit? Well, we have to reform inefficient government bureaucracies. We need some public sector union reforms, probably around work rules and job classifications, perhaps around pension and medical benefits. We're going to have to raise some more tax revenue: sales tax, gasoline tax, income tax. We're going to have to regionalize some public services, 351 towns and cities. What are the lessons I draw for our public sector unions? Public sector unions are going to have to become part of the solution. They're going to have to help find ways to improve productivity and reduce the cost of public services. UAW has now been doing that aggressively in the last few years with the auto companies. Public sector unions must make a better case to their own consumers. The natural constituency for public unions is not only their own members. It's the parents of the kids they teach. It's the citizens they protect. Those who pay the taxes, those are the consumers of public services. And this requires that unions, union editors, tell a more persuasive story than they are now today. Unions must see taxpayers as a potential ally and work to gain their trust in the way the UAW is now working with the auto industry to try and regain the trust of consumers of automobiles. Right? And I think what that means is that we have to start thinking about a brand new bargain. At least that's what I call it. Where unions play actually a greater role, as Michael was suggesting, as the governor was suggesting, in improving service quality and innovation in return for greater job security and public respect. What are some of the aspects of that new grand bargain? Let me finish with this. I think the union needs to join in efforts to boost productivity and efficiency, make public services more efficient. They have to improve the quality of services, improve, for example, our underperforming public schools. They have to help us be innovative in offering services. And they have to become a partner with the consumer, the taxpayer, to meet the needs of the taxpayer and the taxpayer's families. So the union can play a serious role in helping shape social policy, balancing the interests of their own members with the interests of the public, and explaining this both to their members and the public. So, with that, I'm going to quit, because I have more I can talk about later, but I very much want to hear Mr. Ross and Mr. Stutman, and hear their thoughts about where we are in terms of the public sector union.